The morning Isabel Norwood first arrived at Stormwick Castle, the sky hung low and colourless over the Northumberland moors, and the wind came in hard from the sea, sharp enough to make her eyes water, even before she stepped down from the carriage. The driver hopped from his seat and lowered the small iron step, but she hesitated a heartbeat, gloved fingers tightening around the handle of her modest travelling bag as she took in the vast, brooding facade before her. Stormwick did not look like a place that welcomed the uninvited. It rose from the grey-green land, as if carved from the same stone, its turrets and battlements outlined against the clouds, its long rows of windows as blank and watchful as a line of soldiers on parade. She had been told it was impressive. No one had told her it would feel like judgment. "Miss Norwood," the steward, a tall, spare man with thinning hair and an air of harassed dignity, stepped forward from beneath the shelter of the great portico. "You are late." "I beg your pardon," Isabel said at once, her breath clouding in the cold air. "The roads were muddy, sir. The horses—" He cut off her explanation with a brief nod that was not quite unkind and not at all interested. "Her Grace does not like to be kept waiting. Come along." And that was how it began for Isabel Norwood. Not with welcome, but with a correction and a command. She followed the steward, Mr. Tanner as she would later learn, through the massive oak doors into a great hall that swallowed her whole. The air inside held the faint smell of coal smoke, beeswax and stone. To the left, portraits climbed the walls in an ascending line of storm-grey eyes and proud mouths, generations of Blackmoors glaring down as if to assess her worth in a single glance. To the right, a long corridor stretched away into shadow, lit by high-arched windows through which the pale winter light filtered only reluctantly. Isabel straightened her shoulders. She had not come to Stormwick as a guest. She had come as an employee, a companion to the Duchess Dowager, and she knew enough of the world to understand that her comfort, or lack thereof, was of very little consequence in such a place. Even so, she could not help the small unbidden spark of hope that lit within her chest. Stormwick Castle, for all its severity, represented stability, respectability, a position she had not thought to secure after her father's sudden death and the swift, humiliating sale of the modest rectory that had been her home since childhood. She had grown up among sermons and books, not ballrooms and titled acquaintances, and yet here she was, walking past carved stone pillars and beneath ceilings so high they seemed to belong more to cathedrals than to a private residence. Perhaps, she thought with a kind of desperate optimism, there might be room for her here. Not in the hearts of its masters, she was not sentimental enough to expect that, but at least in its daily rhythms, a task to perform, a role to fill, a place where she could be useful enough to be permitted to stay. Mr. Tanner led her up a flight of stairs and along another corridor, this one lined with narrower windows that looked out onto an inner courtyard. The cold seemed to seep through the glass and creep along the floor. He paused finally before a set of double doors of dark wood, polished to a hard shine. "Her Grace is at breakfast," he said. "You will present yourself, speak when addressed, and otherwise remain silent. The Duchess is particular about her peace." "Yes, Mr. Tanner," Isabel replied softly. He gave her one assessing glance, as though measuring not just her appearance, but her capacity to follow instructions, then opened the door and announced her in a firm voice that carried more respect than warmth. "Miss Isabel Norwood, Your Grace." The breakfast room was smaller than she had imagined, though in a house such as this, smaller was a relative term. A generous fire burned in the grate, casting a rich glow over a table laid with silver and fine porcelain. At its head sat a woman whose back was as straight as a poker, despite the evident frailty in her wrists and neck. Her hair, once perhaps as dark as Isabel's, was now entirely white, gathered into an elegant knot beneath a lace cap. The Duchess Dowager regarded Isabel with sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. "So," she said after a long pause in which Isabel stood, pulse fluttering 3 paces inside the room, "you are the rector's daughter." "Yes, Your Grace," Isabel said, dropping a curtsy that was more rehearsed than instinctive. "My father was Reverend Samuel Norwood of St. Bartholomew's in—" "I know where it is," the Duchess interrupted. "Sit." There was only one empty chair at the table, and it was not quite at her Grace's right hand. Not quite that favoured a position, but near enough that Isabel felt an unreasonable rush of gratitude. She set her bag gently near the door and took her place, careful not to rattle the china or disturb the stillness that seemed to reign in the room. "You read?" the Duchess asked, as a footman poured tea into Isabel's cup. "Yes, Your Grace. Latin and French and—" "Do not be clever," came the dry reply. "No one likes a clever woman, least of all clever men. You read English aloud with clarity and without affectation?" "Yes, Your Grace," Isabel said, swallowing the instinctive retort that rose to her tongue. Her father had always praised her for her intellect, but she was not so naive as to believe the world valued the same qualities he had cherished. "Very well." The Duchess lifted her own teacup, the fine porcelain clinking softly against its saucer. "You will read to me in the afternoons. You will answer my correspondence when my hands ache. You will walk with me when my joints permit. You will not, under any circumstances, trouble my son with questions, complaints, or foolish notions. He has burdens enough." A faint, almost imperceptible softening passed through the older woman's features at the mention of her son, but it was gone so quickly that Isabel might have imagined it. "Do you understand, Miss Norwood?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good. Eat. You look as though a stiff wind might carry you off the moor." Isabel obeyed, though the food sat like unfamiliar stone in her stomach. Somewhere in this enormous, implacable house, the Duke of Stormwick himself lived and moved, and she was not to trouble him. It was an easy command to obey, she thought. Men like him existed in a world far removed from that of a rector's daughter, even one employed in his mother's service. At that table, on that first morning, Edmund Blackmore was nothing more to her than a name and a title, a distant, imposing presence like the castle itself. It would not remain so. In the days that followed, Isabel learned the geography of Stormwick the way a sailor learns the temper of the sea, quickly and with an understanding that mistakes would not be kindly received. She rose with the winter light, dressed in the small chamber assigned to her near the Duchess's suite, and presented herself promptly at the appointed hour. She read aloud after breakfast, her voice steady and even as she moved through sermons, novels, and the occasional volume of essays that the old woman affected to disdain and yet insisted upon hearing. "You slur your consonants when you grow tired," the Duchess observed one afternoon, when the light was fading and Isabel's throat burned from hours of reading. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Isabel said, forcing her voice into crispness. "Do not apologize," came the reply. "Correct. There is no profit in apologies. There is profit in improvement." It was as close to praise as the Duchess ever came, and over time Isabel found she did not mind. There was a certain clarity in such unvarnished expectations. She knew what was required of her. She met those requirements. She remained. The Duke, on the other hand, was more an absence than a presence at first. Isabel saw him only in glimpses, a dark figure at the far end of a corridor, coat tailored to immaculate precision, a silhouette passing through the courtyard on horseback, his shoulders broad and rigid, the sound of a door closing quietly somewhere she did not have leave to go. The first time she saw his face clearly, months had already passed. It was late spring by then, the Northumberland sky reluctantly admitting a wash of pale blue, and the moors beyond the castle softening from brown to green. The Duchess had taken to napping in the afternoons, her health uneven, and Isabel had been granted a rare hour to herself. She took a book, one of her father's, more worn than the volumes in the castle library and therefore more comforting, and slipped into a small, unused sitting room at the end of a lesser-known corridor. The room contained nothing of great value, which made it all the more valuable to her. A faded chaise longue, a narrow window overlooking the kitchen gardens, a rug that had seen better days. It felt, in a way the grand rooms did not, like a space where she might exist without careful measurement. She sat beneath the window, the light falling over her shoulder, and lost herself in words that spoke of faith and endurance, of the quiet heroism of ordinary lives. The book smelled faintly of damp and old paper. She breathed it in like a benediction. She did not hear the door open. "Who the devil are you?" The voice snapped through the quiet like a whip crack, low and hard-edged, and Isabel flinched so violently that the book slipped from her fingers and fell open on the rug. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding, and turned toward the source of the interruption. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the latch, the other resting at his side with a tension that spoke of habitual control rather than ease. Edmund Blackmore was not a handsome man in the way of fashion plates and ballroom dandies. His features were too severe for that, his mouth too firm, his nose a fraction too strong. But there was something arresting in the sheer force contained in the set of his shoulders, the steady, unblinking grey of his eyes. Grey like the castle, grey like the sea before a storm. "Your Grace," Isabel said, dropping an awkward curtsy. She felt at once that she had somehow trespassed, though she knew this room was not in regular use. "Forgive me. I did not know—" "Who are you?" he repeated, ignoring her apology. "Isabel Norwood, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered. "I serve as companion to the Duchess Dowager." There was a brief silence. She could feel his eyes on her, measuring, weighing. "My mother's companion," he said at last, as though he were filing the information away in some inner ledger. "I was under the impression Mrs. Albright still held that distinction." "Mrs. Albright retired some months ago, Your Grace," Isabel said, practicing the same precise clarity she used when reading aloud. "Her health no longer permitted—" "Yes, yes," he cut in, with a faint, impatient wave of his hand. "I recall something of the sort." It occurred to Isabel with a small, sharp pang she quickly suppressed, that the details of his mother's daily life were so distant from his own concerns that he could not keep track of the woman who attended her most closely. She wondered whether the Duchess minded, and then decided that whether she did or did not, she would never say so. "This room is not in regular service," the Duke said, his gaze sweeping once around the faded furnishings before returning to Isabel's face. "Why are you here?" "I sought a quiet place to read, Your Grace," she said. It was the simple truth, and she had learned from the Duchess that simple truths were often best. "Her Grace is sleeping, and I am at liberty until she wakes." "Liberty," he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it faintly distasteful. "You work for my mother, Miss Norwood. Your liberty is a flexible concept." He stepped into the room then, and she had to force herself not to retreat. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, not carved by laughter, but by years of frowning into the distance, into ledgers, into responsibilities. There was a faint shadow along his jaw, as though he had shaved early and the day had grown longer than he had anticipated. "The staff have designated quarters for their leisure," he continued, "the servants' hall, the attic room used for mending, the kitchens, if Mrs. Jessup is feeling magnanimous." "Yes, Your Grace. This is not one of those places." "No, Your Grace." Another pause. The air between them felt tighter somehow, as though the room had shrunk. She waited for the dismissal, for the reprimand, for the instruction that she was to keep to her rightful sphere. It would have been entirely in keeping with his station and his demeanour. The Duke of Stormwick did not owe explanations to his mother's hired companion. Instead, he surprised her. "What are you reading?" he asked. Isabel blinked. "Your Grace?" "The book," he said with a flick of his eyes toward the volume lying open on the rug. "You appeared absorbed." She stooped at once to retrieve it, brushing carefully at the yellowed pages, as though she could undo the indignity of its fall. "A collection of sermons, Your Grace," she said, "by an old friend of my father's." "Your father was a clergyman." It was not a question. The Duchess had clearly said as much to him at some point, and he had tucked the fact away along with 1,000 others. "Yes, Your Grace." "And do you find them so compelling, these sermons?" A faint, almost mocking note entered his voice, though it seemed directed more at himself than at her. You looked as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The smallest of smiles threatened at the corner of Isabel's mouth, though she suppressed it. "Words can sometimes do that, Your Grace." "Can they?" He regarded her with something that might have been curiosity, if a man like Edmund Blackmore permitted himself such a luxury. "It has been my experience that the world is stubbornly persistent." She said nothing. There was nothing she could safely say to that. Whatever burdens he carried as Duke, land, tenants, parliament, debts, were not her province. Her world was smaller. One elderly woman's comfort, one narrow bed, one fading book that smelled of home. "If you must haunt neglected corners of my house," he said at last, Do so without leaving evidence behind. Tanner will have apoplexy if he thinks dust has begun to reproduce in here. Yes, Your Grace, she repeated for what felt like the 100th time since he had entered. She held the book close, its worn leather warm against her palms. He turned then, as though the matter were decided and the conversation over. He reached the door, paused with his hand on the latch, and glanced back at her over his shoulder. You may use this room when it is unoccupied, he said. The words so abrupt it took her a moment to realize they had been meant as a concession. So long as it does not interfere with your duties. Relief and something perilously close to gratitude surged through her. Thank you, Your Grace. He did not acknowledge her thanks. He merely inclined his head just barely and left, closing the door behind him with the same quiet control that seemed to govern all his movements. For a long moment after he had gone, Isabel stood in the middle of the room, the book pressed to her chest, her heart beating too fast. She had, she realized, just spoken to Edmund Blackmore for the first time since her arrival, beyond a murmured greeting or a hurried curtsy in a hallway. He had not smiled. He had not been charming. He had not in any way that a reasonable woman might recognize endeavored to make an impression, and yet he had impressed himself upon her all the same. It was not love, not then. Love, as she would later understand too well, is not born from a single conversation in a neglected room. It grows slowly, root by invisible root, beneath the surface of daily life, until one morning you wake and realize it has wrapped itself around your entire being. What she felt in that moment was something smaller, more fragile, and thus perhaps more dangerous, the first stirrings of fascination. Over the months that followed, Stormwick settled around her like a second skin. The servants came to accept her presence with the wary pragmatism of people who understood that the house's hierarchy existed for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. Mrs. Jessup, the cook, began to mutter less sharply when Isabel passed through the kitchen to fetch tea. The housemaids occasionally paused to share tidbits of gossip, always mindful of her position, somewhere between their world and the drawing rooms upstairs. From these snippets, and from her own observations, Isabel pieced together a picture of the man whose name she spoke with automatic respect. The Duke rose early. He walked the estate in all weather, boots dark with mud. He spent long hours in the library, not among the novels and sermons she read to the Duchess, but at the massive desk near the window, bent over correspondence and ledgers. He congratulated no one, blamed himself aloud for nothing, and rarely raised his voice. When he did, it was not in temper, but in that controlled, cutting tone that made grown men blanch and scurry to correct whatever error had provoked it. He was, as the Duchess had said, burdened. Duty weighs on him, the old woman remarked one evening, when Isabel had closed the book and the fire had burned low to embers. He would be a happier man if he were a less honorable one. Isabel, who had been raised to see duty as protection rather than punishment, hesitated. Is it not possible to be both, Your Grace? Happier and honorable. The Duchess's laugh was dry as old paper. Perhaps on Sundays, when one is in church and the hymns are agreeable. The rest of the week, my dear, life demands choices. My son makes the correct ones. That is not always the same as making the kind ones. Isabel thought of the Duke's grey eyes, of the set line of his mouth. She thought of the way he had permitted her the use of the little sitting room, without ever quite framing it as a kindness. Does he ever laugh? She asked, then bit her tongue, startled by her own boldness. The Duchess's gaze flicked to her face, sharp and suddenly more interested than usual. Why do you ask? I have never seen it, Isabel said, spreading her hands helplessly. He seems very serious. He is very serious. The Duchess shifted in her chair, her expression distant, as if looking back through time. He laughed as a boy, less so as a young man. Not at all, I think, since... She broke off, the moment closing like a door. When she spoke again, her tone was once more brisk, dismissive. It is no concern of yours whether the Duke laughs, Miss Norwood. Your concern is that I am kept comfortable and entertained until I die. When I do, you may concern yourself with what comes next. The words, delivered so matter-of-factly, struck Isabel with more force than any scolding could have done. Until I die. When I do. She had, of course, always known that her position depended on the continued existence of the elderly woman who now regarded her with that unwavering, unadorned gaze. But knowing something in the abstract and hearing it laid out so plainly were different things. "What will become of me then, Your Grace?" she asked before she could stop herself. The Duchess considered her. "You are not pretty enough to catch a fortune hunter's eye," she said, in the same tone one might use to evaluate a piece of furniture. "You are too well bred to be taken for a common maid, and too poor to attract the sort of gentleman who marries for love. You have no dowry, no powerful relations, and no obvious talent beyond your capacity to read without tiring my ears." Isabel's cheeks burned. She looked down at her folded hands, blinking rapidly. Tears would be not only useless, but humiliating. "However," the Duchess continued, as though Isabel's quiet mortification were of no relevance, "you are neat, you are punctual, you are discreet. You have not yet made yourself tiresome with confidences or chatter. These are not qualities to be dismissed. Should you remain so, I will ensure you are not put out into the road the moment my body is in the ground." An odd sort of relief loosened the tightness in Isabel's chest. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Do not thank me," the older woman replied sharply. "Merely remember that you occupy this precarious middle ground by my sufferance and my son's indifference. Do nothing to attract his attention, and you may yet live to a respectable middle age within these walls." It was good advice. It was perhaps the worst advice she would ever receive, because for all her efforts to make herself invisible, for all her careful, quiet movements through the castle, and her scrupulous avoidance of any behavior that might draw notice, there were moments, brief, scattered, and always unintentional, when Edmund Blackmore did see her. He saw her one evening when a storm rolled in from the sea with such violence that the windows rattled in their casements, and the great hall echoed with the sound of driving rain. The Duchess had retired early, her joints aching, and Isabel had been left to carry a tray of untouched supper back to the kitchens. Halfway down the main staircase, the house was plunged into sudden darkness as the wind snuffed out a row of candles. She froze, her foot hovering above the next step, the tray wobbling in her hands. "Hold fast," came the Duke's voice from below, steady and close enough that she could feel the faint shift of air as he moved. A hand, firm, gloved, undeniably real, closed around her elbow, steadying her. "The servants will relight them in a moment." "Your Grace," she managed, the word almost lost in the booming of her own pulse. "Do you make a habit of carrying trays in the dark, Miss Norwood?" he asked, the faintest hint of dry humour threading through his tone. "Only when the weather conspires against me, Your Grace." He made a low sound that might have been a suppressed huff of amusement. "The weather conspires against everyone. It is one of its charms." Light flared then as a pair of footmen at the base of the stairs relit the nearest candles. The Duke released her elbow as soon as the shadows retreated, stepping back just enough to re-establish the proper distance between them. She did not look up. She did not dare. "Be more cautious," he said. "Stormwick's stairs are unforgiving." "Yes, Your Grace." He moved on, his footsteps receding along the corridor, and Isabel continued down in his wake, more shaken by that brief touch than by the darkness itself. He saw her another time when the Duchess's cough worsened, and Isabel spent a long night at her bedside, the air heavy with the scent of camphor and fever. At dawn, desperate to clear her head, she slipped into the chapel, a narrow stone space tucked along the east wing, where the morning light filtered through glass stained with scenes of saints and martyrs. She knelt, not because she believed her prayers held particular power, but because the posture steadied her. Norwood. The single word spoken from the back of the chapel made her start. She had not heard anyone enter. She rose halfway, turning. The Duke stood with his hat in his hand, his hair slightly disordered, as if he had run his fingers through it one time too many. He did not look like a man coming to pray. He looked like a man who had wandered into a place where people prayed and was not entirely certain why he had done so. "Your Grace," she said softly, lowering herself fully to sit rather than stand before him. It felt wrong to tower over a duke, even from a kneeler. "How is she?" he asked without preamble. There was no need to clarify whom he meant. There was only one person whose health could place that particular note of tension in his voice. "Resting at present," Isabel replied. "The physician believes the worst of the fever has passed. he exhaled, a sound that was not quite a sigh. Good. The word was simple. It held a weight far beyond its single syllable. She is fond of you, he added, as if the admission cost him something. Isabel's heart twisted. I am honored by her regard. She is not easy to please, he said, looking up at the narrow stained glass window as though the saints there might confirm it. She always preferred clarity to comfort. So she has often said, Isabel murmured. He made that same, almost amused sound again, the one that never quite became a laugh. Yes, he said, she would. There was a pause. In the filtered light he looked tired, the planes of his face more starkly drawn, the darkness beneath his eyes more pronounced. You should rest as well, he said at last. You are no use to her, or to me, if you fall ill. I am quite well, Your Grace. You will say that, he replied, until you are not. He turned then, as if the conversation had run its course, and took a step toward the door. Your Grace? The question escaped her before she could stop it. He paused, glancing back. Yes, Miss Norwood. Do you... She faltered, then forced herself to continue. Do you ever come here to pray? His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shuttered. No, he said. I come here to think. About what? The question was impertinent. She knew it the moment it left her lips. Her breath caught. He did not rebuke her. He did not answer either. About what cannot be altered, he said finally, and what must be borne. Then he left, the sound of the door closing soft as a sigh. In such small moments, scattered through years that otherwise blurred into a steady rhythm of duties and seasons, Isabel's regard for Edmund Blackmore grew. She did not name it, she did not speak of it to anyone. To do so would have felt not only foolish but disloyal to herself, as though she were exposing a tender, defenseless part of her soul to a world that had neither the time nor the inclination to treat it gently. She simply lived in its shadow. She saw his flaws with the same clarity with which she admired his strengths. He was proud. He was cold. He dismissed people too easily when they did not fit into the narrow confines of his responsibilities. He could be cutting in his disdain for incompetence, impatient with weakness, relentless in his own self-discipline. Yet he was also fair in his distant way. He paid his tenants on time and saw to their grievances, even when doing so required difficult decisions. He listened to the steward's reports without visible boredom. He walked the estate in rain as well as in sunshine. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble recklessly, did not keep a mistress installed in some glittering London townhouse. Some men were cruel in their indulgence. Edmund Blackmore was, if he was cruel at all, cruel in his restraint. It was enough for Isabel, enough and too much. Years slipped by. Years. She grew from 19 to 24, then to 27. The passage marked more by the deepening of the Duchess's lines and the increasing number of grey strands in the housemaid's hair than by any change in her own circumstances. At some point, without quite noticing when, she ceased to think of herself as someone who might one day marry. The castle had become her world. The idea of a life beyond its stone walls felt as distant and abstract as the cities mentioned in the newspapers the Duke read. She had, she told herself, all that she needed. A place to sleep, food, books, a purpose. It was not a lie. It was simply not the whole truth. The rest of the truth sat quietly inside her chest, watching the Duke as he passed through corridors and into rooms, aware of him in the way one is aware of the weather, as something that could not be altered, only endured. He, in turn, moved through his life as though she were one more reliable fixture of the castle, the way he might think of the grandfather clock in the hallway or the great oak tree on the south lawn. Noticing it, perhaps, when it failed to function as expected, but otherwise accepting its presence without conscious acknowledgement, it might have continued thus indefinitely had the world beyond Stormwick not finally forced its way in. The letter arrived on a wet October morning, the sort of morning when even the fire seemed to burn reluctantly. Isabel had just finished arranging the Duchess's breakfast tray when Tanner appeared in the doorway, a folded sheet of heavy paper on a silver salver. For His Grace, he said, more to the air than to either woman. From London. marked urgent. The Duchess's gaze sharpened. "London rarely sends anything that is truly urgent," she said. "It sends things that are inconvenient." "That is not the same." "Nonetheless, Your Grace," Tanner replied, unmoved. "Give it to Edmund," she instructed. "If he is not yet downstairs, send a boy to hammer on his door." Isabel carried the tray to the bedside, the fine china rattling softly as she set it down. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, making them creak. "What do you suppose it is?" she asked without thinking. "Parliamentary nonsense," the Duchess said. "A bill, an appointment, a scandal, a tiresome cousin in need of funds. Do not waste your curiosity on such things. It is like wasting a good wine on a man with a head cold." Isabel smiled faintly, but a prickle of unease slid down her spine. She did not like turning points. She preferred the predictable comfort of sameness. She did not yet know that the letter from London contained a proposal that would, in time, uproot every quiet piece of her carefully ordered existence. Nor did Edmund Blackmore, when he broke the seal with his usual controlled impatience and scanned the contents, understand how deeply its words would complicate the one part of his life he had never bothered to examine. The years of silent loyalty, embodied in the woman his mother called companion, and he, when he thought of her at all, called simply Norwood. That understanding would come later. For the moment he read and frowned, and made a sound of irritation that echoed faintly down the corridor outside his study, down to where Isabel stood with a stack of fresh linens in her arms, pausing just long enough to wonder what might have disturbed the Duke of Stormwick in his fortress of composure. She did not yet know that whatever decision he made in response would not consider her at all. That, more than anything, would be what finally taught her how to leave. The letter from London did not leave Edmund Blackmore in peace. It sat on his desk for 3 days, folded and refolded along the same sharp creases, the wax seal long since broken, its contents now a quiet, insistent pressure at the back of his mind. He went about his duties with outward composure, met with tenants about repairs to a collapsed wall, discussed autumn accounts with Tanner, reviewed correspondence from the steward in London regarding the townhouse he had not visited in over a year. He spoke, he listened, he signed his name, but always when he returned to the library, the letter waited. "My dear Blackmore," it began in that polished, confident hand he remembered from school days. "As you know, the time has come for me to set my own affairs in better order. I have found a match that suits my needs in every respect. Lady Charlotte Willoughby is as spirited as she is accomplished, and her dowry will go some way towards soothing the more impatient of my creditors. There is only one small obstruction, which I trust a man of your pragmatism will understand and help resolve." Lord Redford was not a cruel man. He was, in Edmund's estimation, merely selfish in the carefree way of those who had always been permitted to believe the world existed to accommodate them. Years ago, when they were both younger and foolish enough to think themselves invincible, Edmund had made a promise forged after a night of too much wine and too much talk of duty and despair. Redford, drunk enough to be sincere, had declared that if he were ever pushed to the brink of financial ruin by his own excess, he would take the honourable path. He would withdraw from society entirely, live in quiet obscurity, and leave the game to men better suited to it. "Or marry a fortune," Edmund had said dryly. "Never that," Redford had sworn, thumping the table, laughter in his eyes. "I will not sell myself like some merchant's trinket. If I ever do such a thing, you have my leave to call me a coward to my face. Better yet, forbid it. You are a moral man, Blackmore. You must be good for something." Edmund, more sober and already beginning to feel the weight of a title newly inherited, had agreed to nothing aloud. But he had looked at his friend's flushed face and thought privately that there were worse fates than an advantageous marriage arranged to steady a crumbling estate. Now, years later, Redford wrote of Lady Charlotte Willoughby, a young woman Edmund had met in passing at a London dinner, all bright chatter and quick glances, and spoke of honour as though it were a concept that could be negotiated in ink. There is only one small obstruction. The obstruction, as it turned out, was an old understanding, never formalised, never truly binding, between Lady Charlotte's family and Edmund's own. A suggestion made by the late Earl to the late Duke that their children might do very well together, should inclination and circumstance ever align. The Willoughbys are conservative creatures, Redford wrote. They cling to the ghosts of past conversations as though they were legal documents. Lady Charlotte assures me she harbours no tender expectations in your direction, but her father will not proceed while that old intention hangs like a ghost over the negotiations. You must write to him, Blackmore. You must say plainly that you have no plans to seek her hand, that the idea, if it ever existed, has long since withered and died. Without your word, this cannot move forward. Edmund had read the letter once with a detached irritation, a sense of being dragged into a complication that did not concern him. He had read it a second time with the uncomfortable awareness that, in truth, it did concern him, not because he had any wish to marry Lady Charlotte, but because his silence could be interpreted as something it was not. His father and the old Earl had, it seemed, allowed themselves a pleasant fantasy. It would be dishonourable to permit its shadow to ruin another man's prospects. And on the third reading, he had paused over the line that made his jaw tighten. If you have any gentler creature tucked away in that frozen northern fortress of yours, any poor relation or governess you have secretly warmed to over the years, it is at least your good fortune that the world will not expect you to marry her. You, my friend, can afford to marry where it is convenient. I cannot. It was a jest, of course. Redford knew nothing of Stormwick's inner workings. He had never met Isabel Norwood. To him she was a theoretical figure, a symbol of the sort of woman men in Edmund's position might find at hand, useful and unobtrusive, never fully seen. Edmund put the letter down then and stared at the fire until the logs blurred. Any gentler creature tucked away. There were, in fact, very few women at Stormwick. The housemaids, the cook, the laundresses in the village, the vicar's wife, and Isabel. Norwood. He had never until that moment permitted himself to think of her in any category beyond the one his mind had assigned to her at the outset. His mother's companion, reliable and quiet, with a clear voice and a knack for being where she was needed before anyone thought to ask. She was neither servant nor gentlewoman. She occupied a narrow space that he found, if he thought of it at all, convenient. She did not require his attention. She did not demand his time. She did not complicate anything. Except that once Redford's careless sentence lodged in his mind, he could not entirely dislodge it. It made him notice things he had previously ignored. He noticed, for example, that Isabel's hair, always neatly pinned, always modestly arranged, caught the firelight in the drawing-room with a hint of deep chestnut that had nothing to do with the dun plainness he had assumed. He noticed that her hands, gloved or bare, moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke not only of habit, but of care. He noticed that, on the rare evenings when his mother insisted she join them at the table, rather than hovering at the edge of the room, she listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words were measured and intelligent. It irritated him, this noticing. He had no wish to be one of those men who constructed romantic fantasies around the nearest woman of mild expression and good manners. He had too much respect for both marriage and Norwood's precarious position to entertain such nonsense. And yet, one afternoon, he stepped into the corridor outside the Duchess's rooms, just as Isabel emerged carrying an empty tea tray. She did not see him at first. Her head was bent, her brow slightly furrowed in thought. The sight unsettled him because it suggested that she had an inner life entirely separate from everything that concerned him. Norwood. She started, the tray tilting. Your Grace. She corrected the angle quickly, steadying the cups with practiced grace. Forgive me, I did not hear you. Evidently. He kept his tone dry, almost bored, to conceal his own discomfort. My mother, how did she sleep last night? Her expression grew serious at once. Restlessly, Your Grace. The cough disturbed her more than usual. I have asked Dr. Hale to call again this evening. He nodded. Good. A pause then, because the question that rose to his tongue felt oddly personal, and he disliked the sensation. And you? Your Grace? Were you able to rest? He clarified, annoyed at himself for needing to do so. A faint flush touched her cheeks. It is my duty to sit with Her Grace when she is unwell. I manage perfectly, I assure you. That was not the question, he said. For a moment she looked at him directly, and he felt again that peculiar jolt from years ago in the chapel, as if he were being measured in a way he could not quite control. "No, Your Grace," she said quietly. "I did not sleep much, but I am well enough to fulfill my duties today." "Well enough," he repeated. "You are not indispensable, Miss Norwood." "No, Your Grace," she agreed. "I am not." The simplicity of the statement unsettled him more than any argument would have done. "You may request assistance," he said abruptly. "Mrs. Jessup can spare one of the younger maids to sit a few hours in the night if needed. See that you avail yourself of that." "I would not wish to burden—" "It is my decision whose time is burdened in this house," he cut in more sharply than he intended. "Not yours. Do as I say." Her eyes dropped at once. "Yes, Your Grace." He moved past her, the matter decided, and yet as he walked away, he had the distinct, unwelcome sensation of having stepped into something he did not entirely understand. In the weeks that followed, his attention slid toward her in ways he refused to name. He noted if she was at table with the Duchess or reading aloud by the window. He noticed if her voice sounded strained, if there were shadows beneath her eyes. He did nothing overt. He asked nothing that could be construed as inappropriate. If anyone had accused him of particular interest, he could have denied it with complete sincerity. After all, he reasoned, a duke was responsible for the well-being of everyone under his roof. To inquire after the health of a woman who devoted herself to his mother's care was no more than basic decency. He did not ask himself why basic decency suddenly felt like a precarious slope. For Isabel, the change was subtler, but no less confusing. She had grown so accustomed to moving along the edges of Edmund Blackmore's awareness that the slightest shift in his gaze unsettled her balance. She did not know about Redford's letter or the careless reference to some gentler creature in a northern fortress. She knew only that the Duke began now and then to speak to her, as if her answers mattered. "Norwood, what is your opinion of this proposal?" he asked one evening, tapping a folded letter on the table in the small parlour his mother favoured when she was too tired to sit in the larger drawing-room. Isabel, who was in the midst of setting out a fresh pot of tea, froze. "Your Grace?" "Mr. Harrow suggests we enclose the lower meadow to improve yield," Edmund said, his eyes on the paper. "Tanner believes the tenants will resent the loss of common grazing. My mother," he added dryly, "believes any change made after 1790 is an affront to nature itself. What do you think?" Isabel set the teapot down very carefully. She had, over the years, heard enough of estate talk to assemble a rough understanding of such matters, but no one had ever asked her to voice it. "I am no farmer, Your Grace." "Nor is my mother," he replied. "It does not prevent her from having a strong opinion. Speak." She took a slow breath. "If the tenants feel wronged, there may be trouble," she said. "Even if the yield improves, people do not readily forget when they believe something has been taken from them. It might be wiser to proceed more gradually, or to find some way to offset their loss. Work offered. Reduced rents, perhaps, for those most affected." He looked at her then, really looked, and she fought the urge to lower her gaze. "You believe resentment is a more dangerous crop than grass," he said. "Yes, Your Grace," she answered. "In my experience, it is harder to uproot." The Duchess made a small sound that might have been amusement. "You see, Edmund, the girl is not entirely decorative." "She is not decorative at all," he said, almost absently. The words hit Isabel like a slap and a caress simultaneously. She knew he meant them as a sort of praise, that her value lay in usefulness, in clarity, in a mind he could trust not to weep or flutter. But some buried, foolish part of her winced all the same. She had never considered herself beautiful. She was too plain for that, too ordinary, but to hear herself dismissed from that realm entirely, even in service of a compliment, reminded her forcefully of who she was and where she stood. "Nonetheless," he added, unaware of the small turmoil he had caused, "in this instance I am inclined to agree with her. Tanner will not be pleased." "Tanner," the Duchess sniffed, "is pleased by nothing except well-organized shelves and an absence of dust. Go and argue with him, Edmund. Norwood will pour me another cup of tea." "Yes, Mother," he said, with the resigned patience of a man accustomed to such commands. As he left the room, he paused briefly near Isabel's chair. "Thank you," he said, not quite under his breath. She did not know whether he referred to the tea, the opinion, or the years spent quietly at his mother's side. "You are welcome, Your Grace," she replied. That could perhaps have been all. A slight warming, a few more words exchanged, a slow deepening of something comfortable and safe. Had nothing else intervened, Isabel might have lived the rest of her days at Stormwick, growing older as the Duchess shrank into her pillows and the Duke's hair slowly threaded with grey. She might have watched the world from the same windows, walked the same corridors, and considered herself, if not happy, then at least resigned. But the world is rarely so accommodating to fragile equilibrium. The Duchess Dowager's decline, when it came in earnest, was both swift and drawn out, a contradiction Isabel would not have thought possible until she lived through it. There were weeks when the old woman seemed as sharp as ever, dictating letters and criticizing Isabel's pronunciation of certain words. There were other weeks when she slept nearly round the clock, her breathing shallow, her skin papery and cool. One winter night, snow pressing against the window panes, the physician took Edmund aside in the corridor. Isabel could see them from the threshold of the bedchamber, the doctor's grave expression, the Duke's rigid posture. "Soon," Dr. Hale was saying, in a low voice that nevertheless carried. "Days, perhaps. A week, if she is stubborn enough." "My mother has never been anything else," Edmund replied. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace or shout. But Isabel saw the way his hand tightened around the back of a nearby chair, the tendons standing out white against his skin. "Is there nothing—" he began, then stopped himself. He was too intelligent to ask for miracles. "Comfort," Hale said gently. "That is all that remains." Comfort. That Isabel could provide. She moved through the following days with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She bathed the Duchess's face with cool water, spoke when the older woman wished to talk, sat in silence when she did not. She read aloud favorite passages from familiar books, though she was not certain how much was heard. She smoothed creased pillows, warmed chilled hands between her own. She slept in a chair by the bed, waking at every altered breath. Edmund came often, though he never stayed long. He sat in the hard-backed chair on the opposite side of the bed, his large hands folded between his knees, his gaze fixed on his mother's face. They spoke little. There was nothing that needed to be said. The words that might have mattered belonged to years long past. "Do not brood," the Duchess rasped at him once when Isabel had stepped away to fetch fresh linens. "It is morbid." "I am not brooding," he said. "You are. You were born brooding. You spent half your childhood staring out of windows." He made a faint sound, the ghost of that almost amused huff. "Who else was there to look at?" he asked. "Father was in London. You were managing everything. The windows were less demanding." Her fingers twitched weakly toward his. "Do not be too hard on Miss Norwood when I am gone." His gaze sharpened. "I have never been hard on her." "That is the trouble," the Duchess murmured. "You have never been anything at all on her. She is loyal. She has given me years of her life. See that she does not regret it." "Mother—" "Promise," she insisted, the word thin but unwavering. He hesitated. In the doorway, Isabel stood very still, the fresh linens folded in her arms, invisible by habit and necessity. "I promise," he said at last. The Duchess relaxed, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. "Good. Now go away. You make the room heavy." He did as she commanded, because he always did. As he passed Isabel at the threshold, he did not look at her, but she could feel tension radiating from him like heat. 2 nights later, the Duchess Dowager of Stormwick died as quietly as she had lived most of her later years. Isabel was there, sitting in her accustomed chair, one of the Duchess's hands cradled between her own. The old woman's breath grew more shallow, more spaced, and then simply stopped. Isabel waited, her own lungs refusing to move, for some sign that this was merely another of those strange pauses that had frightened her before. None came. She leaned forward, her ear near the frail chest. Silence. "Your Grace," she whispered, though there was no longer any need for the title. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door closed softly. Snow fell against the window, muting the world. Isabel lifted the hand she held, and pressed her lips to the cool, fragile knuckles. "Thank you," she said, voice barely audible even to herself. "For shelter, for clarity, for everything." Then she rose, smoothed the sheets, and went to find the Duke. She encountered him in the corridor outside his study, speaking in low tones with Tanner. The steward's usually impassive face was pale. He broke off at once when he saw her. "Miss Norwood," Edmund said, frowning slightly, "you ought to be resting. Has there been some change?" "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He went still. Tanner took one step back, as if making room for the blow. "She is gone," Isabel continued. It was peaceful. For an instant, a heartbeat, something unguarded flashed across his face. Pain, certainly, but also a kind of bewilderment, as though he could not quite reconcile the idea of his mother's absence with the reality of the house still standing around him. "I see," he said quietly. "Did she—" he swallowed. "Did she say anything at the last?" Isabel thought of the request the Duchess had made days before. "Do not be too hard on Miss Norwood. See that she does not regret it." "She was not in pain," Isabel said gently. "She was calm. I believe she was content to go." He exhaled slowly, as though releasing something he had been holding for a long time. "Very well." His voice steadied. "Thank you, Miss Norwood. You have been invaluable to her." And to you, she thought, though she knew better than to say so. "In the morning," he continued, "we will send word to the vicar. Arrangements must be made. Tanner, see that the household is informed. They will expect instructions." "Yes, Your Grace," Tanner said, bowing. "And you, Norwood," Edmund added, his gaze returning to her. "You will rest." "I am quite able to—" "You will rest," he repeated, cutting off her protest. "You have watched over my mother for years. You will now permit others to watch over you, at least for a night." The unexpected gentleness in his tone undid her more than any outburst could have done. Her throat tightened. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. He nodded once, a man reassembling his composure piece by piece, and turned back toward his study. Isabel returned to her now empty chair by the bed and sat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time since she had come to Stormwick, the house felt not like a shelter but like a question. What will become of me now? The days of mourning that followed passed in a blur of black crepe, muffled footsteps, and low voices. Edmund moved through it all with a grim efficiency that impressed even those who had long considered him unapproachable. He oversaw the preparations for the funeral, received neighbors and distant relations with sober courtesy, and stood at the head of the family in the small chapel as the vicar spoke of faith, of endurance, of lives well lived. Isabel watched from a pew near the back, her hands folded, her eyes dry. She had shed her tears in private, in the quiet hours when no one needed her. In public, she was as composed as any member of the household staff. After the burial, when the last of the guests had departed and the house had sunk into that peculiar silence that follows great events, she found herself in the little sitting room the Duke had once allowed her to claim. The faded chaise, the narrow window, the old rug, all just as they had been on that first day she had discovered the space. Only she was not the same girl who had settled here with a worn book and a cautious hope. She sat without reading now, hands folded in her lap, staring at the garden below. The world looked unchanged. The bare branches of the trees scratched at the grey sky. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimneys. Snow lay in uneven drifts along the path. Inside her something shifted. The Duchess had been blunt about Isabel's situation. "You will concern yourself with what comes next when I die." It had always seemed a distant problem, deferred by the old woman's stubborn vitality. Now that vitality lay in the cold ground, and the problem could no longer be postponed. Isabel had, she realized, no true claim on Stormwick anymore. She had no contract, no legal position. Her presence in the castle had been justified by one role only: companion to the Duchess Dowager. With that role gone, she was— what? A guest? No. Guests were invited. A servant. Not quite. The servants had their own quarters, their own hierarchy. She had always hovered, neither upstairs nor downstairs. An encumbrance. The word slid into her thoughts with a cruel sort of accuracy. An extra mouth at the table, an unnecessary line in the household accounts, a reminder of the past when the present already demanded so much. Edmund's promise to his mother, that he would ensure Isabel did not regret her years of loyalty, was unknown to her. Even if she had heard it, she would not have trusted it entirely. He was a man of duty, yes, but his duty was to the estate, to the title, to the future of Stormwick. She was none of those things. She was simply a woman who had allowed herself to love a man who barely knew she existed. The realization crept over her slowly, like cold. She had given him years. Not by his request, not through any explicit demand, but by the quiet choices she made each day. To stay, to serve, to hope in some small, unacknowledged corner of her soul that perhaps, someday, he might look up and truly see her. He had not. Not in the way that mattered. He had noticed her usefulness. He had perhaps come to depend on the smooth functioning of a life in which she played an invisible role. But his heart, such as it was, remained barricaded. His plans, whatever they might be, whatever that London letter contained, would never pivot around the woman who read to his mother and slipped through his corridors like a ghost. If she did not leave now, she thought, she never would. Stormwick would become not just the place where she had spent her youth, but the place where her life quietly ended, unremarked and unmourned by those in whose shadow she had lived. The idea frightened her. It also, in a strange way, steadied her. Love without being seen, wait without demanding, leave without making a sound. She had trained herself in all three. When she rose from the chaise at last and straightened her shoulders, Isabel Norwood felt older than her years. Not in the sense of weariness, though that was present too, but in the sense of having finally understood something she had long refused to face. Stormwick had never truly been hers. If she wished for a life that belonged to her in any measure, she would have to seek it elsewhere. She did not yet know where elsewhere might be. She had no relatives eager to take her in, no fortune of her own, no clear prospects. Leaving would be neither easy nor safe, but staying, she realized, might be worse. That evening, after the household had eaten a quiet, subdued supper, she climbed the narrow stairs to her room and took down the small travel case she had brought with her years ago. The leather was more worn now, the corners scuffed, but the clasp still held. She set it on the bed and opened it. The sound of the hinges, soft and steady, was the sound of something breaking inside her and something else assembling in its place. She began to fold her few dresses with careful hands. Downstairs in the library, Edmund Blackmore stood at the window and stared out into the dark, unaware that the silent fixture of his mother's rooms, the woman who had moved through his days as unnoticed as the ticking clock, had finally reached the end of her waiting and was preparing at last to go. Isabel's hands moved with the steady precision of long habit, folding a grey wool dress into neat quarters before placing it at the bottom of the travelling case. The fabric was worn at the cuffs and hem from years of quiet service, years of kneeling to adjust footstools, of leaning over books in dim light, of brushing snow from the Duchess's shawl during rare outings to the chapel. She smoothed the folds one last time, not because they needed it, but because the motion kept her thoughts from scattering into panic. The room was small and spare, as it had always been. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with chipped porcelain, a single chair by the window that overlooked the stable yard. Moonlight filtered through the frost-laced glass, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches of the yew trees, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the kitchens below. Stormwick slept, or pretended to, in that heavy silence peculiar to great houses after loss. She paused to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers lingering at her temple. At 29, she was no longer the girl who had arrived with wide eyes and a heart full of cautious dreams. Lines had begun to etch themselves at the corners of her mouth, faint but permanent, from years of suppressing smiles that had nowhere to land. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman composed, unremarkable, precisely the sort no one would miss until the gap she left grew too obvious to ignore. A pair of stockings next, rolled tightly. Then the shawl her father had given her before his death, soft cashmere frayed at the edges, but still carrying the faint trace of his tobacco scent. She pressed it briefly to her cheek, eyes closing against the sting, then laid it atop the dress. There was little else. A Bible worn thin from reading aloud, a few letters from a distant cousin in York who had long since ceased writing, a small vial of lavender water that the Duchess had once pressed into her hand with a gruff, "For your headaches, girl. Don't make a fuss." Packing was easier than she had expected. Her life at Stormwick had left few possessions behind, just as it had left few marks on anyone else. Downstairs in the library, Edmund Blackmore poured himself a measure of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard. The amber liquid caught the firelight, glowing like captured sunset against the gloom of the room. He did not drink often. Moderation was one of the chains he wrapped around himself, but tonight demanded some concession to human frailty. The funeral had gone as scripted, the vicar droning through the service, neighbours murmuring condolences over cold ham and negus, the coffin lowered into the family vault with mechanical finality. His mother was gone. The words echoed in his mind without fully landing, like stones skipped across a frozen pond. He crossed to the window, glass in hand, and stared out at the stable yard. A lantern flickered in the coach house, casting pools of yellow light on the cobbles. One of the grooms was still about, no doubt checking the horses against the chill. Edmund watched the man move with purpose, envying the simplicity of it. Tasks with clear ends, no endless ledgers of obligation. Redford's letter lay open on the desk behind him, its careless lines mocking his distraction. He had written the necessary reply that afternoon, polite, unequivocal, releasing Lady Charlotte from any imagined claim. The Willoughbys would be satisfied. Redford's match would proceed. Duty discharged, another loose end tied. Yet satisfaction eluded him. He took a swallow of the brandy, feeling it burn down his throat. The house felt emptier than it should, the silence pressing in from all sides. His mother had been a force, acerbic and unyielding, filling rooms with her presence even as her body weakened. Without her, Stormwick seemed to contract, as if holding its breath. Norwood. The thought came unbidden, pulling his gaze back to the window. Where was she now? Resting as he had instructed, or pacing her small room, replaying the night's vigil? He had relied on her reports these past weeks, her calm assessments cutting through the fog of grief. She had been there at the end, holding his mother's hand when he could not bring himself to intrude on that final privacy. He owed her something, security at the least, a reference, a position elsewhere, perhaps with a family in Newcastle or York. She was capable, discreet, qualities that would recommend her anywhere. He would speak to Tanner in the morning, set aside a sum from the household accounts. It was the practical course. Practical, always practical. The brandy glass stopped halfway to his lips. Something in the stable yard caught his eye, a shadow moving near the side door of the servants' wing, too deliberate for a groom locking up. He leaned closer to the glass, squinting into the dark. The figure paused, head bent, then vanished inside. Probably nothing. A maid fetching forgotten laundry, or Mrs. Jessup checking the stores. He turned away, draining the glass. Sleep would not come easily tonight, but he would force it. Tomorrow demanded clarity. Estate matters, correspondence, the endless machinery of a dukedom that never paused for personal sorrow. Upstairs, Isabel lifted the small workbox that held her few mementos. A pressed flower from the castle gardens, brittle now, a ribbon from the Duchess's last birthday, a stub of pencil worn to nothing from sketching idle patterns during long afternoons. She hesitated over the last item, a folded square of paper with Edmund's handwriting on it, a note from 2 summers past. Norwood, Mother requests the blue-bound volume of essays. If you cannot find it, check the attic cases. E.B. She had found it, of course, and left a fresh pot of tea on his desk as thanks, though he had never mentioned it. The note had been her secret talisman, proof that he knew her name, that she existed in his world beyond the periphery. Now it felt like chains. She slipped it into the case anyway, not for sentiment but for honesty. She would not pretend those years had not shaped her. The final item was her cloak, heavy and serviceable, lined with rabbit fur that had begun to molt. She draped it over the open case rather than folding it, then stepped back to survey her work. It filled less than half the space, a life reduced to portability. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped to keep them from trembling. Dawn was hours away. The first coach south would not leave the village inn until 7, and even then she would need to walk the 3 miles in the dark. No one would miss her before noon. Tanner might notice the empty room by evening, but by then she would be gone, bound for York perhaps, or further to London if her cousin's old address still held. Leaving without a word felt like cowardice. Speaking first felt like begging. She chose silence. It was what she knew best. In the library, Edmund set the empty glass on the mantel and crossed to the desk. Redford's letter stared up at him, that damned line underlined in his mind. Any gentler creature tucked away in that frozen northern fortress. Norwood was gentle in her way, steady, unflinching. He had taken it for granted, like the reliable tick of the hall clock. He sat, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward him. A note to her, perhaps. Instructions for her future. Miss Norwood, in recognition of your service. The pen hovered. What words could encompass years of quiet devotion? He was no poet. Gratitude sat awkwardly on his tongue. Instead, he wrote to the solicitor in Newcastle. Provide for the companion's reference and annuity. Discreetly. E.B. Practical. Done. He sanded the ink, folded the paper, and rang for a footman. The boy appeared promptly, bleary-eyed but efficient. Deliver this to Mr. Hargrove at first light, Edmund instructed. Wake the stables if needed. Yes, Your Grace. Alone again, he extinguished the lamps and climbed the stairs to his rooms. The house creaked around him, settling into the night. His valet had laid out nightclothes and banked the fire low. Edmund undressed methodically, extinguished the candle, and lay staring at the shadowed canopy above the bed. Sleep, when it came, was fitful, haunted by grey eyes and silent hands. Isabel rose before the sky lightened, splashing cold water on her face from the basin to chase away drowsiness. She braided her hair tightly, pinned it under a plain cap, and donned the cloak. The case felt heavier than it should, dragging at her arm as she lifted it. One last glance around the room. The bed neatly made, the washstand dry, the chair aligned with the window, no trace left behind. She slipped into the corridor, boots muffled on the runner. The house held its breath. Down the back stairs, past the kitchens where embers glowed faintly in the hearth. The side door opened without protest, letting in a rush of icy air. The stable yard was empty, the lantern extinguished. She hurried across the cobbles, gravel crunching underfoot, breath fogging in the pre-dawn chill. The gate to the road stood ajar, careless of the grooms, and she slipped through, pulling it shut behind her. The moors stretched dark and endless before her, the path to the village a faint ribbon underfoot. She did not look back at the castle. Looking back would undo her. Half a mile down the road, the first light touched the eastern hills, turning the frost to silver. Isabel walked on, Case bumping against her leg, heart a steady ache in her chest. It was done. Back at Stormwick, the castle woke slowly. Mrs. Jessup stirred the kitchen fire, muttering about the cold snap. Footmen carried coal scuttles. Tanner reviewed the day's orders over coffee. Edmund descended at 8, shaved and composed, requesting eggs and toast in the breakfast room. The solicitor's note had gone with the early rider. Norwood's future was secured. He turned his attention to the post. Bills, invitations he would decline, a report from the London steward. By 10, the absence registered, not as a void, but as a faint discord. No soft footsteps in the corridor. No tray appearing at his study door with precise timing. No clear voice delivering his mother's, now gone, messages. He rang for Tanner. "Miss Norwood," he said when the steward appeared. "Where is she this morning?" Tanner blinked. "Miss Norwood, Your Grace. I assumed she was resting as you instructed." "Find her," Edmund said curtly. "I require her presence in the library." The search began perfunctorily. Her room, the sitting room, the chapel. Rooms checked, servants questioned. Whispers spread. By noon, Tanner returned, face ashen. "She is gone, Your Grace. Her case is missing. No one saw her leave." Gone. The word landed like a blow Edmund had not braced for. He stood from the desk, chair scraping back. "Gone where?" "We do not know, Your Grace. The village, perhaps, the coach." Edmund crossed to the window, staring at the now empty yard. The groom from last night, had that been her shadow? How had he not seen? Years of her presence, woven into the fabric of the house, reading aloud in his mother's rooms, steadying trays in storms, offering opinions in that quiet, unflinching voice. He had depended on it all without naming it. And now, nothing. "Send word to the inn," he ordered. "Every coach, every rider, find her." Tanner bowed and hurried out. Edmund remained at the window, fists clenched at his sides. Not indispensable, he had told her once. A lie, exposed in her absence. The house felt wrong without her. He felt wrong. For the first time in years, Edmund Blackmore wondered what it cost a man to chase what he had never known he needed. The coach to York rattled over rutted roads. Isabel pressed against the window as the miles unspooled. Fields gave way to hedgerows, then to the smoky outskirts of villages. Passengers came and went. A merchant with samples, a mother with fretful children, a parson dozing under his hat. She felt disembodied, as if Stormwick had been a dream from which she had finally woken. Regret gnawed at the edges. Had she left a note? Should she have spoken? But resolve hardened her against it. Better this clean break than slow erasure. By evening York loomed, its minster towering against the dusk. She secured a room at a modest inn, paid from the small wages saved over years. Tomorrow she would inquire after positions. Governess, seamstress, anything respectable. Sleep came in fits, haunted by grey eyes and unspoken words. At Stormwick, Edmund waited. Riders returned empty-handed. No sight of her on the morning coach, no booking under her name. The next to Newcastle, nothing. London, too far too soon. He paced the library, brandy forgotten. Redford's letter mocked from the desk. Marriage for convenience, duty above all. What a hollow jest. His mother's words echoed. She is loyal. See that she does not regret it. Too late. Or was it? By midnight, decision crystallized. He rang for his valet, ordered the travelling carriage readied at dawn. Tanner protested. Estate matters, winter roads. But Edmund silenced him. She goes nowhere I cannot follow. The Duke, who had ignored her for years, now faced the void of her absence. Pride warred with something deeper, rawer. Title intact, or the woman who had loved him unseen. Stormwick watched as its master saddled for pursuit, the first snow of the season beginning to fall. The travelling carriage lurched over the frozen ruts of the York Road, its lanterns cutting thin beams through the thickening snow. Edmund Blackmore sat rigid against the squabs, his greatcoat unbuttoned despite the chill seeping through the cracks. Outside, the world blurred into white, moorland swallowed by drifts, hedgerows vanishing under the onslaught. The driver had grumbled about the weather when they set out at first light, but one look at the Duke's face silenced further protest. Stormwick receded miles behind them now, its stone walls a memory Edmund barely registered amid the storm in his chest. He had not slept after sending the riders. Dawn found him in the stable-yard, barking orders for the carriage, overriding Tanner's pleas about neglected ledgers and incoming post. "The estate will stand without me for a day," he snapped. "It has stood for centuries." In truth, he doubted his own steadiness. Isabel Norwood's absence gnawed like an untreated wound, silent at first, then throbbing with every pulse. Why now? The question circled relentlessly. His mother's death explained grief, exhaustion, a need for distance. But the manner of it, no note, no farewell, slipping away like smoke, felt like indictment. Had he driven her to it? The solicitor's instructions for her annuity lay undelivered on his desk, a hollow gesture too late to matter. He pictured her walking the dark road alone, case in hand, head high against the wind. Foolish woman, brave woman, his woman, though he had never claimed her as such. The carriage hit a deeper rut, jolting him forward. He caught himself on the strap, cursing under his breath. Hours on the road, and no sign at the posting inns they'd checked. York remained the likeliest stop, a hub for coaches south, to cousins or strangers who might offer shelter. If she reached London, No. He would find her first. Memories surfaced unbidden, her hand steadying a tray in the storm, her voice cutting through his mother's fevered ramblings with calm precision. "Resentment is harder to uproot," she'd said of the meadow enclosure, her eyes meeting his without flinching. Intelligence wrapped in quiet, loyalty forged in fire. He had taken it, used it, never repaid it. The carriage slowed as they neared a village inn, its sign swinging wildly in the gale. Edmund thrust open the door before it fully stopped, boots crunching into fresh snow. "Check the registers," he told the driver. "Every arrival since yesterday." Inside, the taproom reeked of ale and wet wool. The innkeeper, a stout man wiping tankards, eyed his fine coat with suspicion. "Room's full, my lord. Blizzards kept everyone pinned." "A woman," Edmund said curtly. "Mid-20s, dark hair, plain cloak. Travelled alone from Northumberland." The man scratched his chin. "Seen a few like that. Coach from the north yesterday morning. Dropped a lady at the York turn. Quiet sort, paid for one night." York. Edmund's pulse quickened. "Describe her." "Neat features. Carried a small case. Asked about post south, governess work maybe. Left at dawn today, I reckon. London coach, full up." Edmund slapped coin on the counter, more than needed, and strode out. "York," he ordered the driver. "Push the horses." By midday, snow cloaked everything in deceptive peace. The carriage pressed on, wheels labouring through drifts. Edmund's mind raced ahead. What would he say? Apologies sat foreign on his tongue. Commands fared no better. She'd walked away from those. Truth then, raw and unpolished. "You are indispensable." Too late? Or just in time? In York, Isabel stepped from a cramped stagecoach onto the Minster's shadow, legs numb from hours of jolting benches. The city buzzed despite the weather. Vendors hawking hot chestnuts, carriages splashing slush, ladies bundled against the wind. She secured her cloak tighter, case heavy in her gloved hand. The inn from last night had pointed her to a respectable posting house for situations vacant. Governess, companion, seamstress, anything to start anew. Her room had been sparse, sagging bed, flickering candle, endless replays of Stormwick's corridors. Sleep evaded her, chased by Edmund's voice. "You are not indispensable." True then. True still. No matter. Freedom tasted sharp, like the air biting her cheeks. She inquired at agencies, voice steady. Positions for a gentlewoman's companion, experienced with the elderly. Polite refusals. "Winter slows things, miss. Try spring." One glimmer, a family in Leeds needing a governess for 2 girls. Interview tomorrow. Enough to cling to. Exhaustion tugged as dusk fell. She found a modest tea shop nursing weak brew by the window, snow piled on the sill. Home felt distant, a word without anchor. Regret flickered, a note left for Tanner at least. But words invited response, and response might shatter her resolve. A shadow fell across the table. She looked up, breath catching. Not him. A stranger, apologizing for the intrusion. She nodded dismissal, heart pounding foolishly. Night brought her to a clean but cheerless lodging house, recommended by the agency. Bed creaked under her weight. She lay awake, staring at cracks in the ceiling, until weariness claimed her. Edmund reached York as lamps kindled, snow turning streets to mirrors. He bypassed finer inns, focusing on posting houses where a woman alone might seek economy. The third yielded fruit. Dark-haired lady, case in hand, booked southbound to Leeds at dawn. Governess post, she said. Leeds. 80 miles. Another day's hard travel. He slumped in the carriage ordering fresh horses, fury mixed with fear. Not for himself, but for her, alone on winter roads. What madness drove her? Loyalty repaid with security. Yet she fled. His fault. Years of blindness. Dawn broke grudgingly as they rolled south. Villages blurred, postboys shouting, wheels groaning. Edmund ate on the move. Bread, cheese from saddlebags, mind fixed on interception. The Leeds coach left early. His carriage, faster, might overhaul it. Mid-morning they sighted the lumbering vehicle ahead. Lanterns doused, passengers huddled. Edmund rapped the roof. Past them, Stop ahead. The driver cracked his whip. They drew alongside, then ahead, blocking the road at a crossroads inn. Snow swirled as both coaches halted. Edmund descended, cloak billowing. Passengers grumbled from the Leeds coach. Merchants, a nursemaid with bundled infant, an elderly couple. No Isabel. Frustration boiled. "Where is the dark-haired woman who boarded in York?" "Got off at the last stop, sir," the guard replied. "Village of Thornby, 5 miles back. Said something about family." Thornby, a speck on the map. Edmund remounted, reversing course. The chase tightened, a noose of his own making. Isabel alighted at Thornby with relief. The Leeds post too crowded, too inquisitive. A faded sign pointed to her cousin's old vicarage, 2 miles off the main road. Perhaps Eliza still lived there, widowed now, in need of help. A long shot, but blood ties endured. She trudged footpaths, snow to her ankles, case dragging. The vicarage emerged, thatched roof, smoke curling. She knocked, breath shallow. A maid answered, puzzled. "Mrs. Hargrove moved to Leeds 3 years past, miss." "No Norwood here now." Disappointment crashed. No shelter. Back to the road? "Any rooms in the village?" Isabel asked. "Blizzard bound, miss. Inn's full of stranded folk." Panic edged in. Nightfall loomed. She retreated, mind racing. The inn then, beggar pallet. Edmund's carriage crested the rise into Thornby as twilight deepened. Lights gleamed from the single inn, stables overflowing. He strode in, snow shedding from his boots. The landlord paled at his ducal bearing. "No vacancy, your grace, sir." "A woman alone," Edmund demanded. "Dark hair, travelling case, arrived today." Recognition dawned. "I, the quiet lady, took the attic room. Only space left. Said her name was Norwood." Edmund's blood surged. Here, after all this. "Take me to her." The landlord hesitated. "She's resting, sir. Particular about privacy." "Now." Up narrow stairs, past snoring merchants. The attic door, plain oak. Edmund knocked, sharp, imperative. Silence, then footsteps. The door opened. Isabel stood there, candle in hand, face paling to ash. "Your grace?" Her voice, soft shock, no fear. Cloak shed, hair loose in waves. Vulnerable. Real. "Norwood." His throat tightened. "Why?" She stepped back, gesturing him in. The room held little, narrow bed, washstand, her case half unpacked. "You should not be here. Nor should you." He closed the door, space shrinking. Running without a word. In this weather. My choice. Chin lifted, eyes steady. "Stormwick holds nothing for me now." "Nothing?" Fury cracked. "Years of service, my mother's life in your hands. And you vanish like a thief?" Her laugh, bitter. "Thief? I took nothing that was mine. No position, no claim. You made that clear." "When?" He stepped closer, looming. "Name the moment." "You said it." Voice even. "Not indispensable. Every glance past me, every order without thanks. I was furniture, your grace. Useful until worn." He recoiled. Truth stabbed. "I never—" "You did." Tears welled, unshed. "I loved your mother. Stayed for her, for Stormwick, for you, though God knows why. But she is gone. I am free. Loved." The word hung, not for the mother. Him. Isabel. Name slipped out, raw. First time so. She flinched. "Do not." "You think I saw nothing?" Voice low, urgent. "Your steadiness when all faltered. Counsel sharper than my steward's. Hands that held my world together." Late praise. She turned away, shoulders taut. "Go back. Marry your Lady Charlotte. Secure the title. Redford's letter, ghost from London. No marriage, no plans, only duty. Until you left and duty cracked." Silence stretched. Candle flickered. "Why pursue?" Whisper. "Pity?" "No." He crossed the room, turning her gently, face close, breath mingling. Realization. You were never background. You were the quiet that held me. Her eyes searched his, grey storm meeting chestnut depth. Walls crumbled. "I cannot stay invisible," she murmured. "You never were." His hand cupped her cheek, thumb tracing jaw. "See me now." Lips met, tentative then fierce. Years poured in, unspoken longing, restrained fire. She clung, case forgotten, world narrowing to touch. They parted, gasping. "Come back," he urged, "not as companion, as mine." Title ward. Duke's bride, unwed gentlewoman? Scandal loomed. She saw it. "Your world will not allow—" "My world changes." Resolve hardened. "Marry me." Shock widened eyes. "Edmund, say yes." Dawn found them entwined. Plans whispered. Carriage readied. Back to Stormwick, not as servant, but equal. But roads twisted. Leeds agency sent word. Position filled. Cousin Eliza miraculously welcomed her. Temptation lingered. Edmund sensed hesitation. Choose. She chose him. Snow eased as carriage bore them north. Stormwick awaited, not unchanged but remade. Yet shadows lingered. London whispers, family expectations. Redford's jest echoed. The carriage wheels crunched steadily over the thawing roads back to Stormwick, the snow giving way to mud under a reluctant January sun. Edmund Blackmore sat with Isabel Norwood pressed close against his side, her head resting on his shoulder, the weight of her both anchor and revelation. Hours earlier, in that cramped Thornby attic, he had laid bare what years of pride had buried, a proposal forged not in duty, but in desperate clarity. She had said yes, her fingers trembling in his, but the road ahead promised no easy triumph. Titles carried chains, and Stormwick's Duke would face them all to claim the woman who had slipped away in silence. Isabel lifted her gaze to the passing moors, the familiar hills now edged with green promise. Exhaustion tugged at her, but so did wonder. Edmund's arm encircled her waist, possessive yet gentle, a touch she had imagined in stolen moments, but never dared expect. "You are quiet," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "Thinking of home," she replied softly. Home. Stormwick loomed, not as prison, but possibility. And what awaits us there? His jaw tightened, the line she knew so well. Tanner's raised eyebrows. Mrs. Jessop's gossip. Letters from London prying into my sudden journey. He paused, hand squeezing hers. "And my aunt, Lady Beatrice, who arrives next week uninvited. She will have opinions on ducal matches." Isabel tensed. Lady Beatrice Blackmore, dowager countess and self-appointed guardian of the family name, had visited once during the Duchess's final illness, cold eyes appraising Isabel as one might a scullery maid. "She will fight this. Let her." Edmund's voice held steel. "Stormwick is mine. You are mine." The words thrilled and terrified. A duke's wife. No longer invisible, but thrust into light she had long avoided. Stormwick's towers rose at dusk, lanterns flickering welcome in the yard. Tanner awaited at the portico, face a mask of professional calm masking shock. "Your Grace, Miss Norwood." His eyes flicked to their joined hands. "Miss Norwood remains," Edmund said curtly, descending to hand her down. "Prepare rooms adjoining mine, and send word to the vicar. We wed within the month." Tanner bowed, retreating without question. Servants gathered at windows, whispers rippling like wind through reeds. Inside, the great hall felt vast yet intimate. Mrs. Jessop pressed hot tea and scones into Isabel's hands, muttering blessings under her breath. "Thought we'd lost you, miss. House ain't right without." Edmund led her to the library, fire roaring. "Rest here. I must write to London, avert the worst rumours." Alone briefly, Isabel sank into a chair, case at her feet. Reality pressed. Wedding a duke meant scrutiny, society, a life rewritten. Did she belong? Or would pride reclaim him? Edmund returned swiftly, kneeling before her, a duke on his knees, vulnerability raw. "Doubts?" "Always," she admitted. "I am no lady by birth." "You are by every measure that matters." He rose, pulling her up. "Marry me tomorrow if you fear tomorrow's interference." Lips met again, sealing resolve. That night, in chambers prepared with hushed efficiency, they crossed lines long imagined. His touch mapped years of unseen devotion. Her responses undid his restraint. Dawn found them tangled, whispers of forever exchanged, but peace fractured swiftly. Morning brought Redford's reply, cheerful acceptance of Edmund's clearance for Lady Charlotte, laced with jest. Fortunate escape, old friend. Though whispers reach town of a northern heiress, do share. Edmund crumpled it, showing Isabel. Gossip travels faster than us. Worse arrived midday. Lady Beatrice, carriage emblazoned with the family crest, sweeping in like judgment incarnate. Tall, angular, pearls at throat, she fixed Isabel with arctic disdain. Edmund, explain this situation. They stood in the drawing room, tea untouched. Aunt, Edmund began evenly, Isabel Norwood saved Mother's final years. She saves mine. We wed soon. Lady Beatrice's laugh sliced. A companion, rector's daughter. Stormwick demands more, a fortune, connections. The Willoughbys still sniff about. Lady Charlotte suits perfectly. No. Edmund's tone brooked no argument. Lady Charlotte marries Redford. I marry Isabel. Scandal, the Countess paced. Peers will mock. Tenants gossip. Your mother rolls in her grave. Isabel spoke, voice steady. Your sister valued loyalty above lineage, my lady. I gave her both. Beatrice whirled. Insolence! You ensnared him in grief's fog. Edmund stepped forward. Enough. Isabel leaves only over my corpse. Tension crackled. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, calculating. Very well, test your folly, but London will devour her. She departed in a swirl of skirts, carriage wheels churning gravel. Edmund exhaled. She bluffs. Isabel touched his arm. Does she? Society crushes mismatches. Not this one. He drew her close. We face it together. Days blurred into wedding preparations. Vicar consulted, banns read, simple gown altered from the Duchess's wardrobe. Servants rallied, flowers from greenhouses, feast planned. Whispers turned to toasts, yet shadows gathered, letters piled. Curious peers, Redford probing, Willoughby patriarch demanding clarification. Lady Beatrice fanned flames from London, tales of Duke's mad infatuation with servant wench. Edmund rode to tenants affirming the match. She steadied this house, she steadies me. Cheers rose, loyalty shifting. Isabel confided fears one eve by the fire. What if I fail you? No polish for balls, no dowry for debts. You succeed already. His kiss silenced doubt. Love mends more than gold. Crisis peaked a week before the wedding. Riders brought word. Lady Beatrice rallied allies, petitioning the bishop to halt bans on impropriety. London gazettes hinted scandal. Edmund rode south overnight, confronting Beatrice in her Mayfair house. Cease this, she smirked over tea. Protect the name, boy. Marry Charlotte. Keep your pet as mistress. Rage flared. Touch her and inheritance shifts. Cousins hunger for Stormwick. Bluff called. Beatrice paled. You would not. Try me. Return brought victory. Bans cleared. Aunt silenced. Wedding dawned crisp. Chapel blooming with hothouse roses. Isabel in ivory silk, veil trembling. Edmund at altar. Eyes locked as she walked aisle alone, no family but house filled. Tanner beaming, Jessup weeping. Vows exchanged. To love, honor, cherish. Rings slid on, gold band simple, profound. Feast followed, toasts, dances in hall. Edmund whisked her to moors at twilight, blanket spread. Lady Stormwick. Wife, she whispered, stars witnessing. Months unfolded, London debut tested, stares, whispers. Isabel held head high, wit disarming foes. Debts eased by shrewd management, her counsel gold. Redford wed Charlotte, jests turned admiration. Stole the best bargain, Blackmore. Child came autumn, son, grey-eyed, sturdy. Daughters followed, chestnut curls. Years wove tapestry, balls graced, charities led by Isabel's hand. Stormwick thrived, love its cornerstone. Edmund aged gracefully, lines now from laughter. You taught me to see, he told her one eve, silver threading hair. "You taught me to be seen," she replied. The Duke who ignored her for years cherished her eternally. Silence broke. Echoes of romance endured. Dear listeners, if Echoes of Romance has warmed your heart, please subscribe, leave a comment, like, and turn on notifications for more timeless tales.